But we're talking on here, it's 175. Let's share the screen in a minute, but we're talking about the meeting between Jacob and the mysterious man, really the night before he meets Esau. And the Torah refers to him as Ish, a man, a man battled with him, wrestled with him, and it's a very mysterious story. So let me just open this up here. We read some of it last week. We'll revisit some of that. .32. Okay, so this is you can share it so everybody can see it. Okay, so this is we began reading this last week, and we read that he crossed Nachal Yabok, the river, the brook of Yabok, which runs from east to west. So he's going from north to south. He crosses the Yabok River, and then that's verse 24. And verse 25 says, verse 25, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. And we mentioned the battle. We discussed that. What was Jacob doing there alone? So here we have two interpretations that seem almost opposites. Rashi quotes a medrash that says that the word levadai, Rashi doesn't say this is the source, but Rashi basically says, we'll read the Rashi. Rashi says he went back to get a few jugs. Because he went back to get a few jugs, therefore he remained alone. And when he remained alone, that's where he meets this person, and they battle. So, and they wrestle, right? So verse 24, but verse 25, and Jacob was left. He had forgotten small bottles and returned for them. That's from Genesis Rabbah. Now that's the version that I have here on the screen. But in the book, there's a little bit more in the brackets. I guess it's a debate if Rashi said it or not, but it's certainly from the Talmud. Talmud continues, Mikan, from here we see that the righteous, they are concerned for their money. In other words, they care about their money. So even though Jacob was an immensely wealthy person, he went back for a few jugs. What's a few jugs? What does it cost already? A few cents. But he went back to get the jugs. So that's what the Medrash implies. Says the Talmud, this teaches that the righteous are worried about their money. And why? Because they don't engage in theft. In other words, everything they have is honestly earned, and therefore they're concerned for their preservation of their possessions, and therefore Jacob goes back and in some sense puts himself at risk even for a few jugs. That's what the Medrash says. Rashi doesn't say it, but I'm pretty sure that the source is that the word levadai, alone, is very close to the word lekadai, to his jug. The bet and the chaf, the letters, the bet and the chaf are very similar. All you have at the back of the bet on the bottom line is just a little ink protruding, right? So, but if you sort of shave that down, the end of the bet, you get a chaf. So you could read it, Vayivater Yaakov lekado. Yaakov remained for his jug. So it's similar enough. Levadai lekadai. Jacob remained for the little jug. So that's what the Medrash says. Now the Kabbalah is very it's a little surprising that we're saying so important to go back and protect every penny you have. So this based on this, not based on this, but consistent with this, Kabbalists explain that every object has a spark, and every person has to elevate and use the sparks within their possessions for a holy purpose. And if this is my possession, it's because my spiritual mission is to elevate this object. And therefore, I can't waste anything. Therefore, if it came to my possession, it is mine, and it's my responsibility to elevate it. People heard of the concept of bashert, that you have soulmate. Bashert means it was sort of in Yiddish for the sort of plan from above. But what is less known that the same piece of Talmud that says that before a person is born, they say this person will marry this person. It also says this field will go to this person. In other words, it's also possessions, right? You're destined to interact with these physical objects, and it's part of your spiritual mission. And therefore, you're supposed to use your possessions, but never waste your possessions. And that's why he says that tzaddikim, the righteous people, they're going to be very concerned about their possessions, because if I have it for a reason. And just because I forgot it, that's not enough a reason to separate myself from them, and therefore Jacob is going back. So that is just an interesting mystical concept, and they connect it to the fact that the righteous don't steal. Well, nobody steals. The point is not just we don't steal, not just the righteous don't steal. It's that they understand that I'm not going to take your thing because that's your spark, right? So I don't want your possessions, but my possessions are my mission and my spark, and therefore for me they're valuable, even if it's monetarily it's not worth a lot of money, especially relative to Jacob's wealth. But spiritually, it's very significant.
Just in terms of the Hebrew, is it possible to read Yaakov Levado as Jacob was lonely?
Lonely. I don't know what lonely is in biblical Hebrew.
Because remember the thing you taught us in the book of Genesis when Adam was lonely, so he could
Lo tovei adam levado. Alone. So it's the same word, which is alone. Jacob remained alone. But I think in biblical Hebrew, alone could be lonely. In other words, what is alone? Alone is either physically, there's nobody else here, which is actually, we mentioned last week, that was not the case. Jacob was not alone physically, there was another man. In the same verse, it says the second clause, Jacob was alone and a man wrestled with him. So was he alone? Only relative to his family, but there was somebody else there. So alone could be lonely, could be physically, or it could be emotionally or psychologically. And that's I'm alone. I could be next to somebody else, but I'm alone. So I think the word is alone. Jacob remained alone. Alone could be read lonely, yes. But I don't think this is, I don't know that there's a unique word in biblical Hebrew for alone and lonely. Maybe there is, I don't know. Okay. So we discussed verse 25, verse 26. Verse 26 is when he perceived that he could not overcome him, he struck the socket of his hip. So Jacob's hip socket was dislocated as he wrestled with him. So was Jacob affected? No, Jacob was victorious in some sense, but he wasn't unscathed. He was harmed. And again, I mentioned last week, the commentaries talk about this. The commentaries talk about what the significance is. We'll get to that in a minute. And then finally, 27, that person, then he said, let me go, for dawn has broken. What does that mean? I got to go. I finished fighting with you. What?
He's a vampire.
He's a vampire. Yeah, I got to be out of here when it's dawn. So Rashi says something interesting. Rashi says he's an angel, and the angels sing praises to God in the morning. That's what it says in the prophets. So I got to go sing praises to God. So let me go. So Jacob sees a good deal when he knows a good deal when he sees it. So Jacob says, and he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And here he has an interesting blessing. He changes his name. He says to him, verse 28, he says to him, what is your name? Let's read it on the screen. He says to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Again.
Do you already know his name?
Well, that's a good question.
I mean, if it's a messenger from
Mashmecha.
God.
Yeah. That's it. But well, maybe we'll address that in a second. You'll see in a minute, because Jacob then asked the angel, what is your name? So we'll get to that in a second. What is your name? And he says, Jacob. Verse 29, and he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, because you have commanding power with an angel of God and with men, and you have prevailed. This translation, everyone translates this differently. He says, you're not going to be Yaakov. So Yaakov, we know, comes from the word heel. That's the etymology. And that he was named Yaakov because when he was born, his hand was grasping the heel of Jacob, of Esav, whatever that means. But that's why it's called Yaakov, heel. So he says, you're not going to be called Yaakov. Rather, you're going to be called Yisrael Kisarita. Here they translate some commanding power. Some people translate because you battled with God and with men, which is obviously wrong. Because sarita doesn't mean battle, doesn't even mean overcome. It means you minister over. The word is sar, minister. We assume that if you're the minister, you're more powerful. So yes, so we can say you overcame, but that's not, we'll see in a minute why overcame is actually not the best translation. But in any case, he calls his name, he changes his name. And then just to get a full picture, verse 30, and Jacob asked and said, now tell me your name. And he said, why is that you ask for my name? And he blessed him there. So he asks Jacob for his name, even though Neil says presumably he knows his name. Jacob wants to know the angel, what's your name? And he says, none of your business. He says, why would you ask? It's like not relevant. Why would you ask? Now we have to understand what he's saying. Rashi has interpretation, other interpretations. So that's the end of the story. And then Jacob, if we're not done with names, Jacob names that place. 31. And then and Jacob named that place Peniel, for he said, I saw an angel face to face and my soul was saved. Again, another interpretation to say this isn't more support that this guy is not just an ordinary man. Because Jacob says, I saw an angel. He says, I saw God, Elohim. Elohim could be God, Elohim could be powerful, could be, here they translate it as angel. But what's funny is that 32, and the sun rose for him after he passed Penuel, and he was limping on his thigh. What's funny about 32? We just finished reading that Jacob called it Peniel. And then he says, the sun shone after he passed Penuel. Is it Peniel or Penuel? Not the biggest question, because in Hebrew grammar, you can do that. We'll talk about that too. But mystically, there's interpretation. So we had a lot of names here. We have Jacob, the angel got to go. Jacob says, I'm not letting you go unless you bless me. The guy tells Jacob, the angel, the person, this mysterious person tells Jacob, what is your name? He says, Jacob, etc. As we mentioned, Jacob, he changes the name. And then Jacob asks him his name, and he says, you don't have to know my name. Just an interesting point before we take Neil's question. Rashi says that when he says, it's not that the angel changes the name. The angel says God will change your name, because later, indeed, God changes his name. When he gets to later in the story, Hashem refers to him. Where's the space? Let's find it. Here, if you look at page 189, Genesis 35, page 189 in the Art Scroll, he says, God appeared to him when he came to Bethel, and verse 10, and then God said to him, your name is Jacob, your name shall not always, they translate always because they deal with the questions, but he says, Lo Yaakov Yikara Shimcha Od, not Jacob would your name be called, no longer, Lo Yikara Shimcha Od, your name will no longer be called Yaakov, rather Yisrael, and he named he named him Yisrael. So why does God have to change his name if the angel changed his name? That's what Rashi says, that the angel doesn't change his name. The angel says, God will change your name. And also, but then it says, the angel says here in verse 30, he says, Vayivarach Hashem, after Jacob asked the angel for his name, he says, it says he blessed him, right, in verse 30. And Jacob asked, and he said, now tell me your name. And he said, why is that you asked for my name? And he blessed him there. So blessed him there, Rashi is going to say, we'll get to the Rashis in a second, but what that implies is that the angel agrees to God changing the name. Because until now you just read it, the angel's going to give information. By the way, God is going to come and change your name. But does the angel agree? Yes, here, and the angel agrees. So let me just add a little bit. Rashi, we'll read the Rashi in a minute. Rashi is going to say the name change is relevant to the blessings. That the blessings that you stole, you're really deserving of them. That's what the name change represents according to Rashi. And that's why here, when it says, and he blessed him there, Rashi says, it's not just that God thinks so, but the angel thinks so as well. And the angel represents Esav. So in other words, Esav agrees that Jacob is deserving. And because we took care of this mystical encounter, in other words, Esav's energy agrees that Jacob is deserving, tomorrow, when Esav and Jacob meet in person, they're ready to reconcile, because subconsciously Esav already agreed to the blessings by his angel, his spiritual energy agreeing to those blessings. So there's a little mysticism here, a little bit psychology. We'll get to that in a second. Go ahead, Neil. You wanted to ask something?
Yeah, so the Torah says that Vayomer Lo Yaakov, but all through Jewish history, the name of Jacob is
So we have to
used
deal with
often.
that. So we have to deal with that.
Sometimes it's Jacob's son.
Yeah, you have to deal with that. As opposed to Abraham, make the question bigger. With Abraham, the verse says, "Your name will not be called Abraham." It's almost the same phraseology, and yet the Talmud says, if you call Abraham Abram, if you don't say Abraham, you say Avram, you violate the positive commandment, because the verse says, "Your name shall not be," or maybe a negative commandment. The verse says, "Your name shall not be called Avram." So how come here it says almost the same thing? I think it's exactly the same thing, and yet the Torah we are going to refer to Jacob, as well as Israel. So that's one of the things we have to deal with.
So don't we typically say Avraham?
Abraham, not Avram.
Okay.
Avram is just the hey gets swallowed up because it's almost a silent letter, but the name is Abraham. The name is Avram. People say Avram Avinu. It's just because it's just the pronunciation Avram Avinu, but it's really certainly when you write it Avraham. It's not Avram.
Right.
Avram.
Yeah, I tend to lose the hay.
Yeah, the hey is silent. The hey is silent. What are you going to do? It's just you have to go out of your way to emphasize it. But
Right.
Conceptually, when you say it, you mean Abraham. You don't mean Avram. Avram was when he was only. If you look at the meaning of the names there, Avram means father to Avram. Avraham means father to a multitude of nations. The word hey, the Torah says, is Hamon Goyim. You're father of a multitude of nations. It's opposed to just the place where he was born. Now, it happens to be that some people would say we want to keep him in the family, but that's not our family. Aram is not even our family. Aram is the place we left, right? So now Abraham is the father of all nations because his message is universal.
Yeah, I find it interesting, and I'm sure it's inaccurate. It's just when he said, "Let me go, for dawn is broken," it's almost as though somebody is coming out of a dream.
Right.
And
So it could be it's a dream. It could be. I'm not saying it's not a dream.
because dawn is typically when.
So dawn is the dream is open, but the dream is about to go. He says, "I got to go. The dream is ending." But he says, "No, I still have to deal with this." The only thing to say now, the reason to say it was not a dream is because in verse he's going to be limping, 32. So the dream did have, if you say it's a dream, it did have a tangible effect on his body, which is possible. It's not impossible, right? Somebody during the dream could experience tension, and that tension could lock things up. Perhaps, I don't know. But the bottom line is the tension is what makes the limp, right? So it's either somebody actually touched it, or psychological tension was so intense. It wasn't just a dream. In other words, even if it was a dream, it did have an effect.
Well, I'm not saying,
Yeah.
because there's no suggestion by any commentator that it was a dream. It was just something that dawned on me.
Yes, but some commentators in general say that when the Torah gets a little bit less than natural, you could say it's a dream. So, for example, is it Abarbanel? I don't remember if it's Abarbanel or Maimonides. I'm just going blank right now. I didn't finish my coffee yet. But they say that, for example, the talking donkey in Balak, they say that would be a dream, because it says they went to sleep, and then that doesn't mean it does say he woke up. But the bottom line is it continues. The verse continues, and it could be at some point you transition into dream, and the subsequent story could be a dream. They say it about, I think the same commentator, I forget who it is, says it about Jonah. The whole story of Jonah being thrown into overboard and being swallowed by the fish and the prayer. All this happens in his dream, according to one commentator, because it says he went to the bottom of the boat, and he went to sleep, and he fell asleep, deep sleep. And then the story continues, but did he wake up? So it's okay. It's not heresy to say that the parts of the story where, now here it doesn't say he went to sleep. So that would be the difference. But it's nishkeferlach, like you say in Yiddish, to say, especially when the stories become a little bit less than natural, it's not terrible to say that it's possible that this happened in a dream. I'm not saying this did, but I'm just saying it's nicht. I don't think it's so terrible.
So maybe, excuse me, maybe that verse about him being alone could allude to being
Sleep.
asleep.
Could be, yeah.
So is Yaakov here and like Yisrael's like aspirationally up here?
Let's get to that. Let's unpack Yaakov. So I want to start with Rashi, then we'll go a little Kabbalistic. So let's start with Rashi because that's the basis. Okay, so I'm going to read the Rashi inside. I have it here. The advantage. Go ahead.
Just one more question.
Yeah.
So Sarita. So is it he's becoming more like his grandmother?
In the sound like Sarah. Interesting.
Is that what the
Interesting.
implication is?
Could be Sarita. Yeah. Less like his mother, more like his grandmother.
What do you think?
Could be. Yeah, I never thought of it that way, but that could be. Yeah. It's hard to ignore the similarity is too strong.
Because I always tell my daughter Sarah that her middle name, Israel's middle name is Sarah.
Right. That's the meaning of the name. Yisrael, Sar. The root is Sar, Sar-El. Understood with God. So let's deal with that. Let's try to unpack that, but let's read a little Rashi's first. Okay. So the first thing is like this. The first thing is we discussed that Rashi about the Avak, about the wrestle. We did that last week, so we'll skip that. We'll go to verse 27. It says, "Send me, for dawn is breaking," says Rashi, quotes the Medrash and Talmud. "And I must recite a song of praise." I have to say Shira, I have to praise God. We say praises, but what do we say? We say Kadosh, 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 Kadosh. We're stealing from the angels. That's really the song of the angels. So he says, "You got to let me go. I have to go and sing." By the way, the source Rashi quotes two sources: Genesis Rabbah, which is Medrash Rabbah, which makes sense. It's understandable why it would be in the Medrash, but it also quotes Chulin 91. Chulin is a tractate in the Talmud. Chulin is literally it means mundane. It means the animals that are not sacred. In other words, it's the laws of eating animals that are not a sacrifice. So regular kosher meat, consumption of meat. What's it doing in the commandment about what's it doing what is this discussion doing in the tractate of Chulin? So because later we're going to have the law that you can't eat the sinew, the gid hanasha, the sinew that was on the hip that was affected, and we don't eat it in any animals because of this story. So that's why the Talmud in Chulin addresses this story, because it's relevant to the law about eating the part of the animal. We don't eat the part of the animal with the sinew. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure, Rabbi.
Right.
No,
Later,
that's too hard a question.
later we're going to say that therefore the Jewish people don't eat the sinew on the hip.
That part I understand.
Okay. Where is that? Where does this law appear in the Talmud? It appears in the tractate Chulin. So once the Talmud is discussing the law that you can't eat this sinew, it discusses the background. So it discusses this story. So that's why the Talmud in that tractate is talking about this meeting.
But in the context of all the lofty stuff that's happening in this chapter, the part about the city
practical.
doesn't make any sense at all.
We'll get to that. I have to get to that too.
Unless you have a great connection.
Well,
Intuitively, it doesn't seem to.
intuitively, there are some details. Intuitively, we don't understand why the focus on the sinew and why intuitively it doesn't make sense. But it's not surprising that a story with such great consequence will have an everlasting mitzvah to remember it. That's not so surprising, right? This is not just a technical thing that Jacob is meeting Esau, but certainly from the spiritual perspective, it's the reunion of the forces it's the unity between Jacob and Esau, which has cosmic effects.
The unity between
In some sense, the peace. Yes, in some sense, the peace. Unity, peace. In some sense, tomorrow, the battle is just the purpose of the battle is the peace. Here he blesses him.
But they never make unity between them.
They hug and kiss.
But
How
then they-
profound. Okay. So you have to start before you can finish, right? You have to get together and give a hug before we can see, is this internalized? Is this going to, in other words, ultimately the purpose of ultimately the Messianic era is the peace between Jacob and Esau on many levels, mystically and historically. We can talk about that. But the point is, this is a big meeting. It's not just a technical story. It's not just happens to be two brothers met, but there's ramifications of this meeting forever. And therefore, both historically and also within every person. And therefore, it's not a surprise that this story is going to be, becomes everlasting by a mitzvah, specifically reminding us of this story. Now, why this sinew and what the significance is, all that we have to unpack. But let's start with Rashi. Let's start at the basic level. Okay, so he says like this: I will not send me, for dawn is breaking. And Jacob says, I will not let you go unless you blessed me, unless you have blessed me. Now, I just want to say that Rashi's agenda, all through the next few verses, it's really a discussion about the unspoken reason for this tension between Jacob and Esav, which is the stolen blessing. The stolen blessing from his father, that Jacob stole the blessings from his father. So therefore, Rashi says, acknowledge for me the blessing with which my father blessed me, which Esav is contesting. Doesn't say that in the verse, but Rashi's saying it doesn't have to say it. What are they fighting over, right? What is the source of this entire tension between Jacob and Esav? The fact that Jacob stole the blessing. So when Jacob tells this guardian angel of Esav, he says, I'm not letting go unless you bless me. He doesn't need the angel's blessing. He needs acknowledgement. He needs him to agree that he was deserving of the blessings that he stole. That's how Rashi is going to learn all these verses. So if you don't like that, let me know right now. So I'll try to defend that. But because Rashi is saying this is really what's at stake. That's what, just because it's not written, this is the unspoken source of the tension. They must be addressing it. They're not addressing a fight that is peripheral to the essential tension, and the essential tension is the blessings. Okay, so the guy said to him, what is your name? He said, Jacob. And he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, because you have commanding power with an angel of God and with men, and you have prevailed. Let's read Rashi's. No Jacob, not Jacob, no Jacob, meaning no longer will your name be called Jacob. Here they translate alone to deal with Neil's question, but okay. It shall no longer be said that the blessing came to you through trickery and deceit, both with nobility and openness. So the word akev is heel, but akva is also trickery. When Esav realized that Jacob stole his blessings, the verse says, that's why he's called Yaakov, because he tricked me twice. He stole my birthright, and now he stole my blessings. He says the word vayakveni, he tricked me. So the word Yaakov could mean trickery. So now when the angel says, no longer will his name be called Jacob, according to Rashi, it means no longer will people say that Jacob stole the blessings with trickery. Rather, you gets it with nobility and openness. In other words, everyone agrees that it's his. And ultimately, the Holy One, blessed be he, will reveal himself to you in Bethel and change your name, and there he will bless you, and I will be there. He then acknowledged them, the blessings, as being Jacob's. This is the meaning of what is written in Hosea. He strove with an angel and prevailed over him. He wept and supplicated him. That's a verse in Hosea. It's the Haftarah of that week of the week of Vayishlach that describes this encounter, right? He strove with an angel and prevailed over him. Jacob fought with an angel and prevailed. He wept and supplicated him. What does that mean? Meaning that the angel wept and supplicated him. With what did he supplicate him? In Beth El, he will find him, and there he will speak with us. That's the end of the verse. The verse continues, Beth El Yimtsaenu, B'Shami Deber. We'll find him in Beth El, and there he will speak to us. So Rashi is using the verse in Hosea to explain, to fill in the missing details over here. Not that the angel is blessing him, but the angel is saying that God will soon appear to us in Bethel, change your name, and I will be there to acknowledge that I agree as well. Esav agrees as well. Wait for me until he speaks with us there. Jacob, however, did not consent to release the angel. And against his will, the angel's will, the angel acknowledged them, the blessings, as being his, Jacob's. This is the meaning of, and he blessed him there, that he entreated him to wait, but he did not wish to do so. From Zohar, volume 3. Interesting. Is it in this Rashi? Zohar, volume 3. This Rashi says it's from, this Rashi says Bereshis Rabbah. In any case, what are we saying? We're saying at the next verse, and it says, and Jacob asked him and said, now tell me your name. And he said, why is that you asked for my name? And he blessed him there. He blessed him there means, I mentioned that before, he blessed him there means, he blessed him there. Rashi says he agreed with the blessings. In other words, initially, he doesn't say, I agree. He says, don't worry, God will change your name. God will acknowledge the blessings belong to you. But Jacob won't let him go. And he only let him go once he says, and he blessed him. The angel blessed him. And Rashi says that means the angel acknowledges that the blessing belongs to Jacob. Okay. He asked him, and why is that, you ask? So he asked him, what is your name? Verse 30. So he says, why is that you ask? I mean, what do you mean? Isn't that a legitimate question? I want to know your name. Answer your name. Don't tell me your name, but don't say, why do you ask? I want to know your name. So Rashi goes to Medrash. We have no permanent name. Our names change according to the service we are commanded to do in the mission upon which we are sent. What is an angel? What is an angel? An angel is somebody who's just fulfilling a mission for God. So what's your name? What's your identity? Identity depends on what your mission is. So what does it help to know my name? Tomorrow my name changes. Okay. So
However,
yeah.
the names change in accordance with the mission.
Yeah.
But at that particular time, he did have a name,
Right.
which certainly wouldn't allude to permanence.
Right. So that's why there are other commentators. Other commentators say that what it means is, what do you have to know my name for? You need me to help you? I'm just an angel. You have to speak to God. Right? So why would you want to know my name? Like, why is that interesting to you? So the first Rashi's interpretation is, I don't really have a name. I don't have an own identity. Let's talk about that for a second. In Hebrew, a shem is your name, but a shem also means identity. And you could say, certainly in biblical Hebrew, you could say your name is your identity. If he says I don't have a name, it means I don't have an identity. I'm an angel. I'm just a conduit, and therefore it's not important right now. But again, other commentators say what you're saying. It's not going to help. What you don't need to know my name. I can't help you. I'm just an angel. You need my blessing, but I can't help you. I'm just an angel. You're asking you want to know my name so you can call me back, right? Put me in your contact and your speed dial. Call me back when you need help. I can't help you. I'm just an angel. So I'm just a conduit of Hashem. Okay, so that's the first layer of Rashi. Did Rashi help? Did he provide more answers or less answers? Did he do anything for us? Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I'm just struggling with the idea that, and we deal with it on Friday. There's this whole interplay between the universal and the particular in Judaism, the oneness and the particular. Here we talk about the oneness of God, and yet we talk about names. And we talk about not only names, but about changing names. Sarah, Abraham, Jacob. Yeah. Interestingly, Isaac never gets a name change. We ask about Moshe says, what is your name at the burning bush? This guy is saying, what is your name? So what are we to make of this duality of the particular and the universal?
Right. So shame, I think the shame, what is your name, Mashimcha, is I'm trying to grasp and I'm trying to understand. And there's always the balance between trying to understand certainly the essence of God or the essence of spirituality, and then the recognition that ultimately it's beyond our ability to grasp, ability to understand, right? So the quest to try to understand is proper. Maybe that's the message of Jacob asking, "What is your name?" Why does the Torah have to?
But I guess what I'm asking in a Torah that emphasizes oneness, why are we so bent on names, on the particular, on the individual, as opposed to the more spiritual oneness?
I think that that's a very deep philosophical question. I think that there's the oneness, but the idea is to make from the many one, right? It's on your $1 bill. E pluribus unum, right? So oneness, God is one, but creation is multiplicity. And somehow or another, we have to understand how the multiplicity is actually expanding the oneness. In other words, if you have one because nothing else exists, it's okay. But if you have a multiplicity, and that multiplicity ultimately acknowledges the oneness, so you have a 1,000-piece puzzle as opposed to a one-piece puzzle, right? So when the puzzle is not built, you just see multiplicity, you see confusion. But then when you take the 1,000-piece puzzle and you make one puzzle, and that one puzzle, all 1,000 pieces express the oneness, in some sense, that's a deeper point. And in some sense, that is the purpose of creation. Because if God wanted absolute oneness, he wouldn't create the world. In fact, the Kabbalists explain that the word for God before the world was created is not one, it's single. Yachid, singular. One means that two is going to follow. One is a part of a series of numbers. 1, 2 is a series. When you say something is single, you're not expecting anything to follow, right? Someone says, "How many children?" You say somebody, you say, "Okay, it's not going to work with children." But one does not negate the second one following. But if you say single negates something else. So the Kabbalists say, why do we say Hashem Echad? Why do we say God is one? We should be saying Hashem Yachid, God is singular. And the answer is he's not singular. We exist, but he's still one, because we're the 1,000-piece puzzle or the trillion-piece puzzle, or I can't count the numbers. Creation is, every cell of creation is part of the puzzle, which expresses his oneness. So with the 1,000-piece puzzle or the trillion-piece puzzle, both are true. On one hand, we each have our own identity. And if I do your job and you do my job, the puzzle is not going to work. And that's why a true puzzle, you never have two pieces that are exactly the same. I have a puzzle. We had a puzzle at home. It was a junky puzzle made in China. I cannot finish it because multiple pieces are exactly the same. I'm like, what am I going to do? How am I know? I'm going to say, and they're all blue. So what am I going to do? They have the sky. So it's like, I can't finish the puzzle. So you can't have a puzzle where any pieces, where two pieces are exactly the same. So too in the creation, every creation has its own specific name and its own specific identity. And it must be different and unique. Otherwise we wouldn't need it. Otherwise it's dispensable. Nevertheless, all the pieces are telling one story. That is a much deeper oneness than buying a painting. You could buy a painting. Why buy a 1,000-piece puzzle? In some sense, which one is greater unity? So one is singular, one is one. And God doesn't want to be singular, he wants to be one. But to one, you can have trillions of pieces telling that oneness. But for that, every piece has to be unique. So that's why on one hand, we have a name. On the other hand, we're part of a greater oneness. And it's not a contradiction, because if I wouldn't have my unique contribution, I wouldn't be able to be part of that greater oneness.
And to take that further, perfecting each of us in a name change or a personality change is important to making even a greater puzzle.
Correct. And maybe I don't really realize what my piece is because I'm layered and I have to take off the layer. And you'll see in a minute, based on Neil's idea that Jacob is Jacob and Israel, that sometimes I have multiple places on the puzzle, right? That's why human beings are complex. I don't have one place, I have multiple places. So I have multiple contributions based on the different layers of identity. Okay. Let's go ahead, Richard.
Yes, in the same school of thought where you're just speaking about Jacob wrestling with the angel, I was reading somewhere that the angel was really the inner conflicts that he was going through,
Right.
not necessarily a being, so to speak. Is one valid more than the other, the point of view?
Yes, yeah, we discussed that last week a little bit. Within himself, he also has that conflict. And he tries to overcome the physical side completely, but he can't. And ultimately, the physical side has to bless the spiritual side, right? The point is not to obliterate the Esav, which the angel of Esav, which now we'll call the physical side of self or the animalistic side of self. Purpose is not to obliterate it. The purpose is, Jacob maybe tries initially, but he realized it's impossible. You're a human being, you're a body and a soul. You're not here to obliterate. You're here to refine. And you're here to make a partnership between the body and the soul. And initially it was a struggle, but initially you struggle. The spiritual side of self and the materialistic side of self do struggle, but ultimately they could make peace. And that's part of the story here. If you want to talk about it, understand it from the perspective of within the person himself.
Well, maybe, Rabbi, for what you just said, you made a good point. The constant struggle. So now you're dealing with another realm called the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara, which is the constant struggle that goes on. Right. Now, I don't know if it's interrelated to what we're talking about, but that's that never ends.
Yeah. So if you want to say Yaakov and Esav within the person, it's the physical and the spiritual within the person. And there's a struggle between the two. And ultimately, there has to be peace. And ultimately, the physical blesses the spiritual, which means that the physical advances the spiritual. And it does so in different ways, but I don't want to go too far into this right now because we still have to finish Yaakov and Yisrael. We'll elaborate upon this, how the physical actually adds to the spiritual. So go ahead, Vicky. We'll take one more question and then we'll try to give some interpretation, because otherwise you're going to say, well, I came here for an hour, I didn't get much. Go ahead, Vicky.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi. My question is like a very small. Do we know if the physical injury of Jacob Israel was permanent or temporary?
So it says later, it says he reached Shechem, Vayavo Yaakov Shalem, he came complete. So ultimately when he came back to see his father, he was healed. So ultimately he was healed. So why are we making a remembrance for something that was temporary? Because according to Nachmanides, as we mentioned, they alluded to it last week, maybe we'll talk about it later again, the night represents exile. The handicap represents the suffering that the nations inflict upon the Jewish people. We're not unscathed, but eventually we're healed. But eventually is the end of history. So we're not there yet. So in the meantime, we want to commemorate the fact that this pain is going to happen and how to deal with it. So we'll get to that later when we get to that commandment. Okay, Jacob and Israel, Yaakov and Israel. So mystically speaking, it's as follows. You have related to what Richard brought up, the concept of good inclination, evil inclination. Yaakov is struggle. The idea of putting your hand on the heel of Esav is clearly a metaphor for struggle. We're trying to figure out who's going to be first. So that's clearly struggle. What is Yisrael? Sarita, you're the minister. Minister is not struggle. Minister is you're overpowered. You're stronger. There's no struggle. That's why I don't like the interpretations that people say, Yisrael means you struggle with God. Yes, you struggle with God, but that's Yaakov, right? Yisrael means that you overcame. And what happens is like this, that within the person, so let's start with Neil's question. Neil's question is, the angel says, you're not going to be Jacob, you're going to be Israel. And when the verse says, don't call Avram, call him Avraham, we only go to Avraham. Here, we go back and we call him Jacob as well. So the Talmud asks the question. Talmud says, how could we call Jacob if God himself, first the angel, but then later God himself says, no longer will your name be called Jacob. So here the English translation solves the problem. They put in a word. Not only will you no longer will you only be called Jacob. That's not what the verse says. So the Talmud says like this: how do we know that you're allowed to call someone Jacob? And how do we know if you call him Jacob, you're not violating the commandment? Because the Torah itself calls him Jacob. So if the Torah itself calls him Jacob, we could also. But that doesn't answer the question. It just passes it on. So the Torah, we know it's okay because the Torah does it. But why is it okay? So that leads the mystics to explain that when Avram gets his name changed, he goes from Avram to Avraham. He has a new identity. Now his mission has been expanded. He's not going back. Jacob has both identities. Part of his soul, there's Jacob, but he also has Yisrael. But once he gets Yisrael, he still goes back to Jacob. And in other words, Jacob is the place where there's a struggle, and in Yisrael is when there is no struggle. And we have both of those identities, and we actually move between the two identities. So, is negativity a temptation for me? If it is, that's the Jacob part of me. The part of me that where it isn't, that's the Yisrael part of me. Part of me is above the struggle. Part of me is in the struggle. Which one is me? I have both identities. Now the Kabbalists have all kinds of ways of doing this, different levels of your soul. But they also say, it even trickles down to, for example, Shabbat and the weekday. Generally speaking, in the weekday, my mission is to be invested in the world. So in the mission of the weekday, there's going to be more struggle embedded, right? Shabbat, I dedicate more time to spirituality. There, I can access the part of my soul, that's Yisrael, where there's no struggle, where there's peace, where I'm in serenity because I overcame the negativity. Or I touched a part of my soul where the negativity is not a struggle to begin with. The temptation is not, the negativity is not tempting to begin with. So now I have both identities within myself. And what Jacob realizes, he doesn't always have to fight because he has the part of himself where he's Yisrael, where the battle is not necessary because within himself, either he overcame the battle or there's a space within himself where battle is unnecessary. Does that mean he's going to stay on that level? No, because in our consciousness, we revert back to different stages of consciousness. And therefore, there's part of my soul where I'm Jacob. And therefore, even if I had a spiritual moment today on Shabbat, Monday, I'm back to the Monday morning blues, not just physically because I have to go back to the office, but spiritually because now we're back in the world. And that's okay. And we move between both of these identities. And that's why when the Torah says, your name will not be called Jacob, we know it must mean it won't be exclusively called Jacob because the Torah itself calls him Jacob. But why does Torah call him Jacob? Because his own identity, he has both, and a Jew has both. So that is that's the spirit, sort of the spiritual interpretation of the double name of Yaakov and Yisrael. Okay, I want to say one more thing before I let you go. The verse says like this. The verse says, your name, let's see if I can share it. The verse says like this. He says, no, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, because you have commanding power over, they say over God and over men. Im Elokim, with God and with men. Now I ask you, which one should you put first, God or men? So some of the commentaries say you really should put men first, because you want to speak, you first say the lesser than the greater. So for example, if I say you're stronger than God, you're obviously stronger with men. Right? Once you say the obvious, you don't have to say once you say the less obvious, you don't have to say the obvious. If I say you won the wrestling match with the greatest wrestler on earth, you don't have to say you won the greatest wrestler and some other guy. Obviously, if you won the first, you won the second. So why are we saying, Sarita, you were minister over God and over men? The big news is you overcame God. So say God first, say only God or God second. Once you say you're stronger than God or you overpowered God, there's no point of saying you overpowered men. You're stronger than men. You were victorious over men. That's obvious. So that is the question, and different people answer this question in different ways. The Hasidic interpretation is from Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev. He says a beautiful interpretation. He says like this. He says, no, it's actually bigger news to say he says literally the word im is together with. You're a minister, you're together with God. Okay? That's not such a big deal to be together with God. I mean, it's a nice accomplishment, but it's not the greatest accomplishment. The greatest accomplishment is to be with God and with men. That while you're together with, right, that's what the verse says. Sarita, you're a minister read it literally, you're a minister with God and with men. The greatest compliment, in other words, the greatest feat is not to be with God. The greatest feat is to be with God while you're with men. While you're amongst people, you're still connected to God. And that's what he's saying. He's saying you achieve mastery over the spiritual and the physical, that you could be connected to the spiritual, to God, while you are in the realm of men, while you are in the physical realm. So that keeps going back to the mystical interpretation that here, the point is not to destroy Esav, but ultimately the point is to make the peace between the physical and the spiritual. And initially there's struggle, and then initially there's some point of embrace. Ultimately, in the Messianic era, we have the ultimate peace between the physical and the spiritual. But that's why that's why we say with God and with men, not two different clauses. Not you're with God and you're with men. Right? You're with God and with men. And therefore it's important to say men after God. While you're with God, you could be with God and with men, and Batuchal, and you could you're able to do so. How do they translate that? Batuchal, here they translated it as, and you have prevailed over the challenge to be connected to the spiritual while being with people in the same way. So that's the story in short. Go ahead, Bob.
Thank you, Rabbi. Just a question. Is this a forerunner of, I mean, this reminds me of the 40 years in the desert. The Jewish people were with God first,
Right.
and then to go to Israel is that a coincidence of the name that suddenly are there with God and men?
Yes, that's the goal. Were they so successful in doing that? Not fully, right? But that's the goal. So in some sense, Neil said, is this sort of aspirational? Yes. Yisrael means we have the ability to do so. Doesn't mean we're always in that state. And therefore the Jewish people themselves are called Yaakov and Yisrael depending on our spiritual state. Are we in a state where we are still in the midst of the struggle? Or are we in a state that to a certain degree, we have mastered this struggle, right? So that is what that, so yes, the goal of Judaism is to be Yisrael, to be with God and with men, meaning to say, even when I'm in the physical, to be comfortable, to be connected to the spiritual, even when I'm in the physical. And that's going into Israel as opposed to being in the desert. But even so, even that itself doesn't always come easy. And when it doesn't come easy, when we're in the midst of the struggle, we refer to it as Yaakov. When we reach a certain level of success in this endeavor, we refer even a moment of success, we refer to that as Yisrael. Maybe the next week we're going to go back to a deeper struggle or a different struggle. So we'll go back to Yaakov. But we're always moving between these two names. Like I said, the Kabbalists explain that there's the weekday and Shabbat is Yaakov and Yisrael. There's also one. I know I'm a little bit over. I'll go another 30 seconds. There's a verse in when Bilam blesses the Jewish people in Deuteronomy. He says an interesting verse. He says, "Lo hibit aben b'Yaakov." God sees no iniquity in Jacob, and He sees no toil in Israel. So again, explaining that consistent with what we're saying over here, God doesn't see iniquity in Jacob. Jacob has no sin, but Jacob has struggle. Lo ra amal b'Yisrael, He sees no struggle, He sees no toil in Israel. With Israel, there's no toil, there's no difficulty. It's the place of your soul where doing the right thing is easy. It doesn't require difficulty. Now, not always are you in touch with that level of your consciousness. So sometimes you're in touch with a consciousness where maybe I don't sin, but it's certainly difficult not to sin. But that's the lower consciousness. That's the consciousness of Yaakov. But as you get to the consciousness of Yisrael, the lower amal, there's no difficulty. It's not difficult to do the right thing. If I touch that place within myself. But even if I do, it doesn't mean I'm staying there. I move back and forth. Go ahead, Vicky. Please.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi. I have a question about the duality of the name of Jacob. It starts only with the father of Jewish nation. Does it kind of highlights the idea that based on the mission of a Jew, we have more complex personalities, and also to have striven with divine and man and overcome? Does it mean that the struggle is over?
So first of all, it's very interesting that when you talk about, the more you talk about the nation of Israel, we're usually called Bnei Yisrael. We're not really called Bnei Yaakov. As a nation, we're Yisrael. Later in Genesis, it talks about the children of Jacob going down to Egypt, for example. When you say Bnei Yaakov, we mean literally the children, right? But throughout the Bible, the Jewish people are called Bnei Yisrael. So collectively, we're much more Yisrael. My personal struggles are my own personal struggles, right? But collectively, our mission, our goal, so it doesn't mean we finished. It doesn't mean we overcame. Not necessarily. It means that we have the energy that can overcome, just like our ancestor overcame. So, but if you're going to name the nation, again, what is a name? A name is a mission. A name is identity. Our identity is Yisrael. Does it mean we're always in touch with our deepest identity? No, it's a struggle to be in touch with your deeper identity. But if you're going to name us as a people, meaning not name me as an individual where I am up to right now in my own personal struggle, in my own personal life, but if you're going to name us as a people, which means you're looking at the generality, you're looking at our general purpose, our purpose is Yisrael. Yisrael means we have the ability to be the Sar, to be the minister, just like our ancestor was, just like Jacob was, or Israel was. But again, even Jacob himself, that wasn't the end of his life. He didn't reach tranquility. He wanted to reach tranquility, but he did not. But what he did realize is that there's a place within yourself where you're beyond the struggle. And therefore, to the extent that even Esav's guardian angel will acknowledge that you deserve the blessing. Now, if you want to talk about this personally, even the negative and the physical side of yourself is happy when you do the right thing, right? So anytime I do something that's more transcendent, in the moment, the more animalistic parts of self don't want to do it. But when you do it, you'll always feel good completely, right? You never feel guilty. You never decided to do something that's more transcendent, either spiritually, but even in the physical world, something that's more, even in the physical, but within the physical, more spiritual. So you're doing something that's more delaying gratification. If I run a mile, okay, so I'm investing in my health. Initially, I don't want to do it. There's a struggle, but never do I come back and feel guilty and say, I should have stayed home. I should have stayed on the couch, right? No, because the physical side, even the animalistic side of self, ultimately will acknowledge that it's better to be transcendent. The other way around doesn't work, right? You could never, ultimately, even the greatest sinner ultimately is going to have guilt, because the spiritual side of self is always going to speak up. That's why the Talmud says, Rishayim, the wicked people are full of regrets. Why? Because they're constantly regretting, because the godly soul is never going to stop feeling that it has not reached its potential. But when it comes to the physical ultimately will acknowledge, just like Jacob's angel is acknowledging that, I think the spiritual side is correct, meaning not just correct, but also makes me happier. So ultimately, but that doesn't mean tomorrow when I have to run a mile, I'm not gonna have to go through the struggle. It doesn't mean that, but it means that I know that ultimately part of me, all parts of me understand that the wholesome decision is the better one.
Thank you.
That's it. See each other in good health. Have a happy, happy, happy day. And Purim, I have to tell you the joke. I forgot to say it this year, but I say it every year. That there was once a Jew that loved to drink alcohol and loved to say l'chaim, but it's not a Jewish thing, so he wouldn't do it all year. But it came the month of Purim, came the first of Adar, 2 weeks before Purim, he couldn't resist. He's already drinking. And his friends tell him, Yankel, why are you drinking? It's not Purim yet. Yeah, Purim, it says, the Talmud says you have to drink wine, so you don't know the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. But that's Purim. That's not 2 weeks before Purim. What are you doing so early? So he said, let me tell you the truth. Let me tell you the real story. The real story is like this. The real story is Haman made a decree to wipe out all the Jews in one day. So Yankel says, I have a question. Why did he insist one day? And what happens if you wipe out the Jews in 2 weeks or in a month? Then he won't be happy. He has to wipe out all the Jews in one day. He says, but Haman was a smart man. He understood that maybe God is going to help the Jews. And if God helps the Jews are going to have a holiday. So Haman says, I don't want the Jews to have a holiday for 2 weeks or a month. I just want them to have a holiday for one day. So that's why he says, I'm going to wipe out all the Jews in one day. Says Yankel, I'm not falling for Haman. I'm going to start the joy early. So I don't think you have to go drink now, but it's not so terrible if you start the joy early. On a serious note, the Megillah refers to the month that has been transformed from sadness to joy. So therefore, the Talmud says when Adar enters, you're supposed to be joyous, certainly just a few days before Purim. So happy Purim, everybody, and we'll see each other in good health, God willing. Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Thank you.
And Purim Sameach.